So today we're going to be starting a special series of reviews in honor of the 20th anniversary of the greatest portrayal of war that I've ever laid eyes on outside of Saving Private Ryan. In similar vein that I've done so far with Marvel's What If, I'm going to be talking about each episode in the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, brought to us by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, and starring a huge amount of people. I mean, crazy amounts. When you see certain people show up in here, at least for me, I start to get a little giddy knowing how their careers turned out in the long run. And we'll talk about them with each episode. There's so many people that show up in here, like Damian Lewis, Ron Livingston, Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, Tom Hardy, Simon Pegg. It's really cool to see a lot of these people in the early days of their career in some ways. And with each episode, I'm going to be going into certain details about the plot. So if you haven't seen Band of Brothers, do us all a favor and go watch the series if you haven't. You are missing out. Or if for some reason you don't care about spoilers, the ball's in your court. Based on the book of the same name by Stephen Ambrose, a notable historian, it focuses on a unit of American soldiers who fought in the final years of the Second World War and how they were able to deal with each situation that they found themselves involved in, from the training that they experienced, fighting in Normandy, Holland, and the Battle of the Bulge, all the way up to the occupation of Germany in the final months of the war. Each episode has a certain central character that they focus on, while also giving time to other people with a certain line or a certain moment or a certain thing that kind of ties everything together with the overall theme that an episode is touching on, showing us the humanity of these soldiers and what they had to deal with and how they felt about the cause that they were serving. And in each episode we get a couple of clips from certain veterans from that company in order to give context as to what happens in each episode and how they all felt, which infuses a huge degree of realism to it, because this is a true story. Even though a lot of the stuff that's in the series is changed for dramatic purposes, it shows you how serious the developers really took this story. And I think they did a superb job in honoring the story of these guys who played a part in sacrificing so much for the service of their country and for our society in the long run, because if it wasn't for them, I think the world would be in a much different place today. Starting off with episode 1, Currahee. This episode chronicles the paratrooper training of Easy Company. All these guys have already gone through the enlistment process and the basic training requirements needed. During the height of the Second World War, these guys decided to join the paratroopers, which at that time was a new concept in American military tactics. The opening of this episode, the 101st is ready to go over the English Channel into France, and the two soldiers, Lieutenant Winters and Lieutenant Nixon, start to reminisce about all the training that they'd gone through in Camp Toccoa, Georgia, which led them to the place that they're at now, under the command of Lieutenant Herbert M. Sobel, played by David Schwimmer, or Ross from the show Friends. Having seen some episodes from that series and other things he's done throughout his career, it's kind of hard for me to take him seriously. That being said though, David Schwimmer really knocks it out of the park. He comes off as very insecure and very unlikable, but in a way almost kind of sympathetic in certain situations, as we see later on.
Name?
Lord George.
Dirt in the rear sight aperture. Pass revoked. Rusty bayonet, Liebgott. You want to kill Germans?
Yes, sir.
Not with this.
He has this huge determination of making sure that his company is the best company in the whole 101st. Anyone who served in the military know that it's no bed of roses. I know that for a fact because I was in there for 6 years. And when I enlisted, it was 2012, and I went through basic training in 2013. Much different environment than what these guys went through. But even so, it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. What these guys had to go through under Lieutenant Sobel, I'm willing to bet that the drill sergeants I had in basic training would find his tactics unreasonable. And even with stuff like where he grants them a day off later in the afternoon and gives them spaghetti as a special meal, only then to pull the rug out from under them and make them run up the hill, leading to some interesting results.
You're a washout, Private Hoobler! You should pack up those ears and go home! Looks like Gordon, son! Aren't you, Gordon? You finished? You do not deserve to get your wing!
The whole point of military training is to break that civilian out of you and build you up into soldier, sailor, airman, marine, whatever the case is. Even by Army standards, I don't think this is exactly excusable. That's just my personal opinion. Again, a much different world back then, so maybe older generations would find that acceptable. Not to get too deep into that. But in an ironic way, he actually manages to unite all of them in their hatred towards him, and it later ends up coming back to bite him in the ass. And we also get to see a rivalry that starts to brew between Sobel and Winters, who actually has the utmost respect from the guys in Easy Company. Richard Winters, as he was later promoted to major towards the end of his career in the military, for those of you who don't know, he's from South Central Pennsylvania. That's me! That's where I'm from! So around here, he's a local hero. In fact, Major Winters is my personal hero. I've read his autobiography, I read another biography that was written by him from a local newspaper writer, and I've obviously read the book Band of Brothers. This guy was a huge inspiration to me in my teen years, especially when I got into the military, and in some ways I've tried to model some of his own principles that he writes down in his autobiography. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, give it a read. It's really, really fascinating, and I think that this guy was a really rare person in this world, and he's been gone for about 10 years. He died in 2011. Guy lived a really long life, and it was a very humble person too. Everything that I've heard about him and seeing interviews that he did in his later years when the series became really popular, a person like Major Winters, that's a rare thing in this world. And however long I live on this planet, I wish I could be half the guy that he was. And the actor that they chose to play him, Damian Lewis, who's most famous now for playing Brody in the show Homeland, perfect casting. And Major Winters himself was initially skeptical of him at first because Winters was blonde and very tan in real life. Lewis doesn't look a thing like him. But then when he saw him play him in certain scenes and certain rough cuts of the episodes that they filmed, Lewis was able to win him over. He's a very serious and stable individual as opposed to Lieutenant Nixon, who's a bit more carefree and reckless, played by Ron Livingston, whom I love how the friendship is portrayed between the two. Polar opposites of each other, but that's what comes out of a great friendship or relationship. Opposites do attract, and in this case it shows. And I'll mention them as we go throughout the rest of the episodes. Certain things that Winters is able to do that I've always liked, as opposed to Sobel, who was not exactly the most encouraging, Winters was also very encouraging, very stern, very strict, and he was also a big motivator to the men underneath him. And little looks that he gives to Sobel, which play on the rivalry between the two, there's this little look that Winters gives that makes me think that he probably thought, yeah, I should have figured you were going to do something like this. And while they're jogging, singing an army cadence, this little glare that he gives him. On the risers, we fall upon the grass. We never land. We always get our ass. It almost seems to me like he's saying, you go to hell. And one thing that I really like about this series, and I think they do a great job of it here, establishing the camaraderie among the men as they're all uniting together in their hatred towards Sobel. All these guys, all these actors, they play the characters so authentically that they feel like real people. And they don't feel like the archetypes or the famous icons that we'd seen in past war films like John Wayne or Audie Murphy, not to dismiss those guys. This feels a lot more realistic. And this series was released not that long ago. And as someone who served in the military, that's a huge thing for me. If you could get a good sense of friendship and camaraderie and some kind of good bond between military service members in any kind of portrayal of war, you succeeded. And here, they do it in spades. The rivalry between Winters and Sobel continues to boil over, as well as the dislike towards Sobel from Easy Company as they go through more training scenarios, like this one instance where Sobel decides to go out and look for the enemy team out in the woods and ends up getting them killed, so to speak. The look on the guy's faces tells us as the viewer that he's losing the respect of the guys underneath him. Not exactly the leader that I would follow into a war zone. And it all comes to a boiling point during one training day over in England, where one of the guys underneath him manages to trick him into thinking that he's actually talking to his superior, gets him to cut through a barbed wired fence. The soldier who tricks him, George Luz, played by Rick Gomez, is basically the comedic bone of the series, and it gives the series a much needed sense of humor. There's a wild bear crap in the woods, son. Oh, that dog just ain't gonna hunt.
Now you cut that fence and get this goddamn platoon on the move!
And then when Sobel realizes that he's been tricked, he decides to get rid of the competition by coming up with some bogus court-martial order against Lieutenant Winters. Winters at this point has become fed up with Sobel's ways and decides to accept the court-martial and say, you know what, pal? You want the company? Take it. I'm done. And it all leads to all the sergeants in the company deciding to mutiny. And even though the regimental commander, Colonel Sink, played by Dale Dye, is not too pleased about this, it causes enough of a fuss to make him realize, wait a minute, with this amount of people that are coming out and saying this stuff, what's going on here? And we get the scene where he decides to reassign him to a training school, and in a way it actually makes me feel kind of sad for the guy because you could tell that it really crushes him, and he probably knows that all his shenanigans for the last 2 years have led up to this point. And so inevitably his replacement, Lieutenant Meehan, comes in, and thankfully Winters is brought back as a platoon leader. And as I mentioned with George Luz with the humor, there's also a lot of funny moments in here too, like Lieutenant Winters' exchange with Private Bull Randleman.
Lieutenant Sobel does not hate Easy Company, Private Randleman. Just hates you.
Thank you, sir.
Or like in the scene when they're on the boat ride to England. My brother's in North Africa, says it's hot. Really? It's hot in Africa? Shut up. Other scenes that I like are the training scenes when they have to put their hands on their heads and walk through the rope fence that's laying on the ground, or crawling under the barbed wire in the mud, which I had to do something like that in basic training, but thankfully it wasn't mud, even though this takes place in the 1940s. In a lot of ways, it takes me right back to my basic training days and think, oh yeah, I know how that feels. Or a small moment like this, where Sergeant Lipton, played by Donnie Wahlberg, when he gets all the guys to get into their physical fitness gear, he sees one other soldier that's just sitting there in a pretty despondent state. Instead of trying to guilt and shame him into changing his mind, he feels bad for him and decides to just leave him there where he is. And hearing stories from other World War II veterans, some people just can't do it. They just can't deal with it. And I don't like to judge people's intentions, because I know that the military is not exactly an easy place to be in. Some guys, unfortunately, are just not cut out for the military. I don't mean to keep going on my spiel or anything. I'm just saying that stuff like this, it always reminds me of what I went through in the military and makes me realize like how much growth I've had throughout those 6 years that I was in. And in a lot of ways, it brings out a sense of pride and patriotism whenever I watch stuff like this, knowing that I was following in the legacy of soldiers like this that served in the Second World War. I'm getting excited because I've always wanted to talk about Band of Brothers on here, and this is my first time actually doing it, so bear with me as I get a little bit excited here. So after Lieutenant Meehan is assigned to Easy Company, 101st Airborne gets ready for the final preparation for the jump into France, and the scenes that we get as they're preparing to go overseas.
Smokes, Hawkins mine, 2 grenades, smoke grenade, gamma grenade, TNT, this bullshit, and a pair of nasty skivvies. What's your point?
Where do you keep your brass knuckles? I could use some brass knuckles.
You're en route to the great adventure for which you have trained for over 2 years.
That's why they gave us ice cream.
And the final scene that we get, when all the guys take off in the C-47s over the English Channel, it's one of the most powerful scenes that I've ever watched. Knowing that this is the moment that they're about to experience combat, that they might not be able to go home, you're left with this eerie feeling, but they know that it's for a purpose, that this is what they signed up for, that we're soldiers and it's our duty to our country. That, along with the beautiful music by Michael Kamen, which sometimes makes me think that John Williams does the score, it adds to the emotion that it's getting out of its audience. So those are my thoughts on the first episode of Band of Brothers. Thank you guys for giving this a watch, and I'm really excited to share my thoughts with you on the rest of the series as I talk about the next few episodes. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are if you've seen the series, and I'll see you guys in the next video.